We're very excited to have Dr. Cindy Cruz with us. She's in the School of Education at University of California, Santa Cruz, who has been working and collecting testimony from Queer Street youth in Hollywood for a while. And she's going to talk to us this afternoon about those experiences and about working with vulnerable populations. And,
Yes.
Without further ado.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Nice to be here at upstate New York in February. I know upstate New York a little bit because I was in Ithaca for a little while, and I know the cold and I can handle it, I think. So, my name's Cindy Cruz, and I do work with queer street youth in Los Angeles, California, mostly in Hollywood. And I've done this work for a long time because I was a teacher with homeless queer youth, and there was a gay high school in Los Angeles, and I was one of the teachers that helped kind of start that. And so for a long time I worked in continuation schools in Los Angeles. Continuation is the place where if you've been pushed out, thrown out, or dropped out of your comprehensive high school, there'll be this other kind of school that will help you accumulate credits, kind of a dropout catch-all continuation. They're usually really small, and in Los Angeles, oftentimes they're in the oddest places. Like they could be in the top floor of the Boys and Girls Club of Lincoln Heights. There could be a small one-teacher school with 10 students in those spaces, or it could be in an empty storefront. In the afternoon, it's used as a small school with 1 or 2 teachers. And so those schools are all over Los Angeles. So my job for a long time was working in these small schools, helping teachers kind of rethink curriculum and continuation. Because if you're in continuation school, it really is about getting as many credits back so that maybe you can go back to your comprehensive high school or that you can graduate. So curriculum in so many of these places is by worksheets. So teachers they don't teach much in continuation. So if you needed like 2 English classes, then we know that each English class is 80 hours of seat work. And so each worksheet that you worked on equals 1 hour of seat work. So if you finish 80 worksheets, ta-da, you're done with an English class. So so you could get through and accumulate a whole bunch of credits very quickly. Like if you were really motivated, you could finish school in just a few months, really, because the worksheets were such limited. Like, what were you going to learn from that? Like, what was your English class going to be like? Were you going to learn to like write or communicate or argue or any of these kinds of forms that we need, especially if you were college bound? That wasn't going to happen in the continuation. It was simply worksheets. So my job was to help teachers change from these worksheets, change their curriculum and begin teaching again. So for a long time, I worked with a lot of teachers, and especially I worked at two particular schools. I worked in a school that was located in Vermont and Manchester in Los Angeles, and it was created in 1992, right after the Rodney King Los Angeles uprisings. So that was one school that I worked at, and the other school that I worked at was the Gay and Lesbian High School that changed in multiple places, but pretty much ended up in Hollywood, California. So when I think about like curriculum and especially English and writing, for me, I think, how do we make young people like the center of their curriculum? Because we could do a gay, like at the Gay and Lesbian High School, we could do a gay and lesbian like English class and add queer authored English books to these kinds of classes, but that's not what I wanted to do, you know? Or, you know, maybe at the other school we could change things up a bit so that we read more Latino, more African American books, which we should anyways. But what I was thinking, in particular for the Gay and Lesbian High School, was maybe we make their own stories center in this curriculum. And you know, I'm an English major. I was an English major, so I always used to think, when I thought about the canon of literature, I was always like, where are the people of color in this canon of literature? Or why is it only like 1 or 2 things? Or maybe it's the last day of the syllabus that I get to read Toni Morrison, or I get to read Sandra Cisneros, or all these other, like, where are those stories? So I'm always trying to figure out, like, how do I recenter stories that I want to hear? So I thought, well, let's let the kids write their own stories. And so I began doing this work that I called autobiography. At the same time, I was also thinking about about counter-narrative, I was introduced to critical race theory. This idea of telling your story or testifying was really interesting to me. And this idea of a counter-narrative really caught my imagination. Peter McLaren and Henry Giroux were beginning to talk about counter-narratives, and I was always like this teacher was constantly reading. And I was thinking about my own kind of feminist politics, about what it means to make the personal political. So many times I want to think about testimonial in another way other than autobiography. So if I had to define testimonial, I would say that testimonial is the narrative or the story of someone who is a criminal, a child, queer, an African American in the U.S., well, I guess it counts for itself, a woman who's been sexually assaulted, someone who's mentally ill, or someone who cannot read or speak English. An immigrant. A migrant would also be someone who would tell a testimonial. So a testimonial is a story from these populations, but it also has to be a story that undermines nation building. So let me go back to what is a testimonial? In 1991, in Latin American literature, there was this huge discussion about this new genre of writing. Part of it was kind of initiated by Rigoberta Menchú, and all the controversies how her testimonial had caused, in particular at Stanford University. At Stanford University in the late 80s, like 1989, every Stanford freshman had to take Western civilization. Well, Stanford changed that. Now every Stanford student had to take world civilization. So one of the books that you read as a Stanford undergrad was Rigoberta Menchú. So there was a huge uprising around, someone even said, why do you want Stanford students to read the story of this illiterate Indian? Like this was like front page news discussions about, it was a huge culture war about whose knowledge was legitimate and whose isn't. And who should be in a Stanford curriculum. So when you think about like this shift from Western civilization, whatever that is, and the great books, to now this world civilization, it ushered in a whole new discussion about multiculturalism, which, we don't really use that word anymore to talk about reading something like Rigoberta Menchú. But in some ways, it caught my attention. Well, why would this story be make such an impact, in these circles? So one of the reasons, so let me go back to defining testimonial. To make a testimonial, to collect a testimonial, usually it's with this population that I've talked about. Usually there's a person who's a compiler, who's usually a researcher, anthropologist, or maybe an investigative reporter who's collecting your story. And so when we collect your story, it's usually the writer kind of rewrites it, reorders it, makes it kind of legible. So there's this thing that you do, that you work together with a writer when you collect a testimonial. A testimonial is always a story that I said before that goes against that nation-building narrative. And so autobiography, you think the autobiography of Ben Franklin. So much of Latin American studies is looking at, people are imagining new countries or new nations through literature, through poetry. Literature and poetry had so much power in those times. I shouldn't say in those times, but there was so much potential there to imagine a new kind of country, a new people through literature. And so an autobiography does that. Novel writing does that. And the Latin American boom is all about this nation-building narrative. A testimonial is not a nation-building narrative. It is a narrative that undermines that. So when you think about Rigoberta Menchú, her book undermines everything that we thought, what Central America, Guatemala, what was happening in Guatemala, and the U.S.'s complicity in what was happening in Guatemala. Her story literally kind of brought down, the whole world now, when she told her story, now looked to Guatemala to say, what the hell is happening here in Guatemala with the genocide and death squads of what was happening politically in Guatemala with a U.S.-backed dictator. So I think it's in 1998 that Bill Clinton, 1998? Yeah. Bill Clinton apologizes for the U.S.'s complicity in Guatemala. And part of that is all through this new kind of knowledge and information generated that begins in that testimonial. At least I want to say that. So when I knew about all these politics, about collecting a story in this way, that was a story that undermined, that was very overtly political, that undermined like this nation-building narrative, here I was, now I'm a grad student, working with queer youth. Again, I kind of stayed in the space that I was in, working with queer youth, and I thought, maybe what I do, maybe how I think about collecting the stories of youth and their experiences of living on the streets of Los Angeles, maybe testimonial could be helpful. Because I didn't also want to be a researcher that was going to be this rational, neutral observer. That really bugged me. I was really like, I don't want to be a positivist, even though so much of our training in social sciences is about like being that neutral, logical, rational observer. I worked with queer youth already for 7 years before I went back to grad school. I knew their lives, how they lived. I went and saw their squats and what happens after 5 days on the streets, what you do to make money, what you do to eat, take a shower, find a place to sleep. Like, I knew their lives very concretely. And so I thought that testimonial would be a really good match for the kind of story that I wanted to tell. And I also thought it would be a good match for the story that young people wanted to tell too. So testimonial, was it just like method-wise? I'm always thinking about like, do my methods match what I want to do? What I want to do with my own research? And I think testimonial was like that match for me, and I made it happen. In education, nobody had done testimonial yet, at least none that I know of. Maybe there had been other people who used something like testifying. Critical race theory had a counter-narrative where someone tells their story that's very much like testimonial. I would call some of those testimonial-like. But I really wanted to like do this work together with young people. And what really attracted me to this was I got to ask these questions of young people about their lives. And for young people, it was a chance for them to tell me and to tell a larger audience what it was like to be homeless and 16 years old in Los Angeles, California. And so when I think about their stories that they tell me of survival sex, sexual and drug and physical abuse, of being foster care students, foster care youth who have aged out of the system, which is primarily the bulk of homeless youth in Los Angeles, of why you run away from Athens, Georgia, from Temecula, California, from Anaconda, Montana, from New York City back to Los Angeles, or that you've been trafficked. Like, I met dozens of youth that were trafficked from the former Soviet Republic, which they would not tell me where they were from. I met kids from Romania, which I'm like, how did you get here? And they would not tell me where they were from. And I met tons and tons of kids from Latin American countries who came up via the train, and also kids who walked across the border by themselves. And so it's really an interesting, when you put these stories together as an educational anthropologist, it's like a stitching. Like, you have these little stories from youth that they offer you, and my job is to stitch them together so that we get a sense of what is happening, not just in Los Angeles, California, but in the U.S. Because I think that we think that hordes of homeless youth happen only like in Rio de Janeiro or Managua, Nicaragua, or Mexico City. No, man, it's happening right here in Los Angeles, California. And probably New York, too. I've gone to New York City to go interview youth who hang out in the piers and stuff, but now with the new gentrification of that part of New York, I don't know New York City at all. So I don't know where youth now have been relocated. So part of testimonial, that's how I began it, but that's always too how I've tried to define it. There's so many problems with doing testimonial and research. One is, I'm sure, does everyone know what the Institutional Research Board is? They call it IRB. So if anyone wants to do research with human subjects, you have to have permission from your institution to do that. And so writing those kinds of things up. So whenever you work with, writing up your plan to work with IRB, so whenever you work with vulnerable populations, say for instance you want to work with people who are in prison, right? If you want to work with women who've experienced sexual assault, if you want to work with people who are migrants, documented or undocumented, I would recommend to everyone who wants to do this kind of work that you make it totally anonymous. And you know, doing anonymity is really tricky because testimonial should be the story of this person. Like, we should know who that is. But man, when we think about these vulnerable populations, we have to protect youth or migrants or prisoners or whoever it is that you're working with. We have to protect them to the utmost. Recently at Arizona State University, a professor there who's in the Transborder Studies Department, he collected stories of migrants who had walked through Agua Prieta Desert to cross into the U.S. And he collected stories about the coyotes and all these things, and he did it confidentially. Confidential is not anonymous. So confidential data, there's a name someplace, or maybe you signed a form saying, yes, I give you permission to write my story down. ICE contacted him. They wanted his data, and they wanted his data with all the names in it. And so there's a huge struggle right now. The university has not necessarily backed him up, but there's a huge struggle right now to that ICE is demanding his data so that they can track down these migrants. So when I think about that story, that's terrifying to me. Like, wow, so the government could come in and take your data for whatever reason that you want it to be. So when you work with these vulnerable populations, I will tell you, even though like people do want to put a name or a place to these kinds of things, that I would say do this work anonymously. So when I went through the Institutional Research Board to get my project approved when I was a graduate student, I went through IRB hell, I have to say. But part of it was getting permission, and the permission was really hard. They wanted me to put a psychologist on my committee. I said, hell no. And then they wanted me to have backup. And I thought, well, maybe that's a good thing. Because they thought that me asking the questions that I wanted to ask, which, here's my big question, tell me a story about your body, right? I knew most of my youth, and as a teacher, I always used that prompt to teach. Like, tell me, I used to ask students, like, as community building projects, I used to say, let's get to know each other, we're going to start this new class. I want you guys to tell me a story about a scar, right? I'm an English teacher, it's storytelling, narrative, right? And so we would start with these, you know, because every scar has a story, so kids would tell these stories, and different schools would have different kinds of stories, but sometimes the stories are really terrible. I was like, what did you just tell me, you know? Like, what is your scar story about? And so it made me think about the body. It made me think about how some stories are literally inscripted onto your body, right? So my dissertation, that is the one question that centers my dissertation is, tell me a story about your body. So I wanted to collect these testimonials of young people who are homeless in Los Angeles to tell me a story about what their body has been through. So part of that, when IRB saw those questions, they were like, what? You know, and so what if you ask that question and someone is emotionally damaged? I was like, I don't think a question like that is emotionally, I think it's going to be freeing, right? Then they asked me, can you find a person who is the most expert in working with queer youth? And I'm like, I've been working with them for 7 years. I think that's me, you know? And then also, like, I had to go back and forth for 6 months with the Institutional Research Board. And so here's a cue for people who are either going to do research here or in grad school. Go visit your research board before you turn in your IRB application so that you can get a sense of what they're going to ask you when they do an overview of your project. And then do whatever they say. Because one thing is, I have to say, this idea of anonymity has been a savior for me because it freed young people to tell me stories that they normally probably wouldn't tell anyone else. including the police. And so I never asked, when I went out into the field, I never asked young people to tell their names at all. I would ask them, like a good HIV counselor that I was, I would ask them to tell me, give me 2 letters and 2 numbers. And so I had this little piece of paper, like a half-size piece of paper, that just asked demographic questions. So in the corner, I would code it. So I'd say, give me 2 letters and 2 numbers. And kids would say, XX69. I'm like, okay, XX69, XX69. And I'd ask them just a few questions. Give me the zip code of the last place you lived. Give me the year that you were born. How do you identify ethnically or racially? Tell me how you identify gender-wise, or whatever, in whatever way. And then the IRB asked me to ask this question: do you identify as gay, lesbian, queer, the whole list, like a huge list? And they'd say all of the above, right? And then I asked them, the one other question was, and that would tell me whether I was going to interview you or not, was, have you been homeless in the past 6 months for more than 24 hours, right? So homeless at any time. And so if someone said yes, then I interviewed them. When I interviewed young people, I paid them. I gave them, sometimes I gave them a $20 gift card. Sometimes I wasn't so rich. Other times I had asked In-N-Out to give me $5 gift certificates, which is cool because you can get like a burger, fries, Coke at In-N-Out. So I would give kids 2 In-N-Out gift certificates. And then I was also donated a whole bunch of 20-minute phone cards. And I don't know if people use phone cards anymore, but in the early 2000s, you still used phone cards. So I would give kids 3 or 4 of those because it's nice. You can call home, hi mom, I'm alive, see ya, And so, I always paid my youth as best I could. Now I pay them better because I have money from UC Santa Cruz. I pay them better for talking to me, and I made these talking spaces. It's so funny, but it's gonna sound weird, but I use tarot cards. And I have this really cool tarot card deck that's a feminist one. It's round. So when some tarot cards, like you look at it and it's like the Tower, that means death. Like I don't want to give a kid the Tower of Death if that's the card they pick. I want to give them cards that are really positive, that talk about change or assessment or any of these other kinds of things, or education. And so this feminist deck was so cool because it was all about transformation. And so it was like the perfect deck to work with queer youth. I'll say 90% of the youth that I talked with were boys or trans boys, and then the other 10% I would say were girls under the age of 18. So it was a feminist deck, and I was like, oh, how do you think the guys are going to feel like if I use this feminist deck? And a friend of mine said, if they're gay men, there's a feminine side to them, so that's what you could tell them. I'm like, okay. But I would have kids lined up to come talk to me. So I have a little table, and I dole out I should go back a little bit. I did all my interviews at 2 places. One, the high school that I've been working at all these years. I worked there. They gave me a little room, and I had some privacy, and I dole out my tarot cards to start the conversation. And then the second place that I worked at was at the LA Gay and Lesbian Youth Drop-In Center. And that place was open from like 3 o'clock to midnight every night. So I just put posters up, IRB approved posters up, and I would recruit kids so they knew that they were going to get paid. And so I got this large sampling of kids who hang out at youth centers, and then I also had the kids that I worked with at the high school. So the testimonial kind of work that I did, it wasn't like a true, like, tell me a story about your life, but it was these little vignettes where I would talk to young people between an hour and 90 minutes. And it was probably one of the most intimate times of my life. Because when you interview youth, you have to be present, which means you can't be like, thinking about something else. You can't be hungry so that you can't focus. You can't be in someplace else. You have to give them like all your attention. And I think for young people in this country, and particularly young homeless people, I think you rarely are asked, what are you thinking? Or tell me a story about your life. or tell me about your experiences, like, because I want to know. And so one of the things that I think that I'm good at, and which is a weird thing, is I can make myself, or I think I make myself, and with you, so vulnerable. And sometimes it was really intense, like you could really feel a connection with some of the youth. I don't want to say like in some weird way, but I want to say that's one of the few times where you get to like really like world travel to someone else's world, or it's a chance for me to be with you in this time in the interview. And I mean be with like in solidarity. You know, I grew up in a really rough place. Fontana, California is not the funnest place in the world. And I grew up always having to like watch my surroundings, like to make sure to see who was looking at me, or where was I going, or what was happening in front of me. Like I was always like, let me just get from A to B without being, you know, molested, assaulted, or, you know, harassed. And so that meant that I was always watching like your body language, or watching to see how people reacted to me, or any of these things. And I think those skills of doing that all my life in Fontana, they've turned out to be really good skills to have as an ethnographer. And so that kind of skill of paying attention to like the body really kind of came in handy in asking these questions of testimonial. So, you know, when I think about the testimonial itself, I think I do have a political agenda when it comes to my own research. I am not the neutral, rational, I am rational, but you know, the neutral, objective, kind of logic-oriented researcher. I'm someone who interprets. I'm someone who wants to have that connection with young people. I'm someone who really is looking to create, like, my research is a political project. So testimonial was such a good fit for me, but it also made, in some ways, I think that kind of work makes life richer. Like, I feel like I've entered and I've been introduced into this world of queer youth and homelessness. Even though, and youth knew me because I was a teacher for a long time. And then after being a teacher, I was wondering, well, where the hell are half my students during the day? So I got trained to be an HIV counselor too, which is free training, which is that the departments of health give all the time. They can't get enough people who want to help with HIV work. And so it's a free training, and you get certified like in 40 hours. And so that kind of, so any kind of that I got a chance to do more kind of qualitative training, I did it, especially when I was working in the street. The other thing about working in the street with street youth too is I really know Los Angeles. I'm the 7th generation of an LA family, and I know like every corner and crack in the sidewalk, and from East LA through Hollywood to the West Side, and I know where youth hang out. And so part of like collecting these stories was me having like this, I want to say like this eco-cultural understanding of Los Angeles, and where do you go like to get breakfast if you're homeless? Where do you go to take a shower? Where do you go to get clothes? Where do you go if you lost your shoes? Where do you go to see the emergency dentist? Where do you go if you've been smoking meth and your teeth have kind of melted down to the gum line? You know, and so also doing this kind of testimonial work with vulnerable populations, not only did I have to learn where all these things were so that I could help young people, like, oh my God, I think we need to go to the emergency dentist at the Sunset Junction free clinic. But that it was also, you also have to be like the walking resource center too. Like you gotta know like where do you go when you're like, I need to go, I need a bed tonight, or I need to eat, I need to go see, I need insurance because I think I'm HIV positive. And so to do this kind of work, I think you have to immerse yourself in those worlds. And not immerse yourself as like some imperial anthropologist, but immerse yourself as someone in solidarity. So the testimonial work that I did, all these things go into it. So maybe that made it easier to collect stories of young people who were telling me stories that challenged what our nation building narratives are. That challenged the fact that maybe our nation ain't so healthy. you know, that challenged the ideas that the social safety net, in particular in California, is non-existent. The numbers of young people on the street are between 4,000 and 10,000 on any given night in Los Angeles County. Now that's Los Angeles County. But I know that in the city of Los Angeles, for youth, there's only 432 beds available. And I know that there's way more young people than that on the street. So you do what you got to do to survive. And another thing I think with testimonial is, I think when you tell your story, there should be, I think a lot of times people don't know how to hear that either. So the flip side of testimonial, I think, there has to be a pedagogy of learning to listen. And I think that's hard for so many people, because that means that maybe our ideas of what this country is aren't quite what it is right now. And people don't want to hear that. Maybe that's why Donald Trump is becoming so popular. I don't know. But I think, I hear testimonials all the time. When you go to, like, in San Francisco, there's the Larkin Street Youth Services. It's a huge, like, youth services center that deals with homeless youth populations. And it'll say testimonial. And so I'm like, oh, I wonder what this is. So I'll click onto their website. And it'll be a young person telling a story of them becoming homeless. And I think that's an interesting use of something that they call a testimonial, because now this testimonial is asking for money from Larkin Street, Youth House. And I think, oh, I'm not sure if I want to call that a testimonial. I want to call a testimonial the story that undermines, that illuminates the problems in the U.S., that has a critique. I also want to call a testimonial a story when a young person says, look, I'm not just telling my story about myself, but this story is a stand-in for hundreds of other young people. So there's a political consciousness that happens when you tell that testimonial. And I think that act of testifying, just a lot like what you do in church, this act of testifying is so important for young people as part of, like, building a critical consciousness. And so that's a little bit of, like, my use of testimonial, or my thinking about testimonial, and about how I've tried to kind of put it together in ed research. It's not like I don't get challenged, though. Like, I just went through tenure, so it's a really interesting process where people read all your stuff, and then they judge you based on your work. And I'm like, oh my God, it's a hazing, right? And so questions come up, and questions like this. Well, how do you know they're telling the truth? Well, I don't know if kids are telling me the truth. But and so what about triangulation? Meaning, like, okay, you told me a story, now I got to verify it from a third party, right? And so I didn't do triangulation, but triangulation happened in weird ways. One of the stories I did collect, which I've never written about, is a story of a young person, this young female Latina, who was a little bit older than the other students, who told a story of being jumped into a gang, but what they did to jump in for other gang members was you went out and you killed a transgendered person, that they went out and murdered a transgendered person. And she was a witness to this. And when she was a witness to this, the older gang members walked over after the act had happened, and they said, this is what happens to queers. Well, she was someone she was a gang member, but she was like, oh my God, I think I'm gay. And so that night, the story goes, she told her mom everything, that she was in the gang, that she had joined the gang, she thought it would be fun, that you could, like, we drank and smoked pot all the time and party, but then this happened. And so in the story, she told me, I wrote it all down, and we still talk, we're still friends on Facebook, but in my work, in all my field notes, whenever someone told me a story, sometimes they would tell me names, and I have to, afterwards, when I would hear the stories, I would I would walk over to, like, a McDonald's or something, and then I would, like, write everything down that I could remember. And then, like, a few hours later, I would go through my notes and I would scratch out with a black marker any names or identifying information, right? I just like scratched it out. So it's a weird story that she tells me. So I put the story in my dissertation, in my study, but then I never wrote about it because I was like, what do I do with this? And what if it's not true, you know? So a few years ago, I was cruising the net like I always do, and I found the Transgender Day of Remembrance page. And there's little candles, and each candle stands for someone who had been murdered or bashed in the last few years in the United States. So I saw John Doe or Jane Doe, Los Angeles, California, 1996, and I was like, oh, this would have been about the age that she would have been. So I clicked it, and it was the damn story. It was the story of a young trans Latina murdered in an alley off of Broadway in Los Angeles. And I was like, oh, she told me the truth, you know? And I think, here's everyone asking me about my research, like, how do you know they're telling the truth? How do you triangulate? And here I found it just by accident on this Transgender Day of Remembrance page. And so it's interesting. I thank God for anonymity doing this kind of work, but I also think, what else do we do with those kinds of stories? Do I tell the police? Does she tell the police? Do I give my research over to the police or something like that? No, I don't do that, you know. But I do think, like, maybe telling your story or testifying, maybe that was the only time that she's ever going to be able to tell that story in anonymity to somebody, you know, and that says so much about the lives of queer Latina youth in Los Angeles, or about the struggles of like this recent immigrant youth in Los Angeles. So when I think about like, is my research, it is doing testimonials, especially with vulnerable populations, like what is the big, there's a huge like issue right now with Ira Roberta Menchu that starts with David Stoll, the anthropologist from Middlebury College. His work is based on basically saying that her testimonial is untrue. And so testimonial, it goes both ways. There's this freeing effect that happens when you collect testimonials, you collect these stories that undermine nation-building narratives, that you do this kind of work. But there's also the flip side of that, where that idea of verifying or triangulating your results can also happen, where someone could say your work, you know, is biased, untrue, is inaccurate. And what does that do to the testimonial itself? So, you know, like, it's a give and take, I think, in some sense. To tell your story right now is a really difficult thing in the U.S., especially if you're a woman, women's stories, because all of a sudden now the scrutiny of it. And yet I still want to say that there is hope in these kinds of genres, in this kind of research project where you talk about where you collect testimonies, where you collect these stories, that when you collect them, like I said before, for me it was about stitching them together into this larger landscape of what it meant to be a youth and homeless in Los Angeles. And if you ever get a chance to, my book will come out soon, but but I think part of that is like to understand this low-level war between youth and police, paramedics, the fire department, caseworkers, teachers, and security guards that happens as part of like this Los Angeles landscape. So it's fascinating work, you know, and I wouldn't change it for anything, but I do know that we have to know its limitations too. So, any questions? I feel like I talk too much. Yes.
So I was right at the beginning, you talked about how like about 90% of the people who interviewed identified as boys and 10% as girls.
And others, yes.
And others.
Mhm.
Can you speak to like why there was that ratio?
I think more boys. So most of the youth I work with, queer youth in Hollywood. There's a huge like subculture of boys who hustle for a living. I say hustle. In the literature, they call it survival sex. And so survival sex, I think, for boys is maybe easier than it is for girls. I think if you're a girl who's homeless on the street, I think the situation is much different for you. The exploitation and things like that have much larger and harder effects on you and your body. Because when girls do survival sex, it's a lot more dangerous. Boys, I think there's a whole subculture of survival sex, but for girls, it is older men buying your time for whatever, for food, shelter, a place to sleep, place to take a shower. You trade sex for to wash your clothes, all these things. And so I think for girls, you're way more vulnerable, and I think it's harder. So I don't think there is, I don't want to say that there is not as many girls in the street, but there weren't as many girls in the places that I did my research. But I do think it's way more boys than girls. Does that answer your question? Yeah, that's a hard question, actually. Yes?
So in San Francisco area, like in Haight-Ashbury, there's like a huge youth homelessness population, and like it seems to be like pretty voluntary. Like I think like part of like a lot of the population, they want to be part of that community. And did you find that in your research that there was like this large community there, and like they would, I guess, want to be part of that, and it was like a bit more voluntary. I mean, like there were reasons behind it, but like they chose to want to be part of that community.
I think there's different kinds of homeless youth communities. I don't know Haight-Ashbury very well, but I know the kinds of kids that are there because I've walked through there. Those kinds of youth who are like backpacks, dogs, kind of anarchist looking, you know, I think those kids are kids who they would call themselves not homeless, but traveling youth, right? And so these traveling youth, spare change, things like that is part of your everyday survival. But it seems to me that a lot of the traveling youth, they also had they had Santa Cruz mountain bikes. And I know a Santa Cruz mountain bike, they start at $1,200 a mountain bike, right? And I was like, oh, you know, like some of these, so traveling youth, I've noticed that a lot of them come from upper middle class families. And I think some traveling youth who travel from place to place with their big backpacks and things, that's a different population than the kids that I work with in Hollywood. That these are kids who, I don't know if you want to call it voluntary, because I think who knows what happens at home that pushes a young person out, right? But I think for homeless queer youth, I think a lot of times you are foster care, you've been pushed out of foster care, or you've been pushed out of your home for whatever reason. Sometimes maybe you have homophobic parents. That wasn't the case as much that of the research that I found. Most of the time, though, what I found is homeless queer youth were on the street because your family kind of fell apart. Like, maybe you live with your grandma and your grandma passed away. Maybe you were in foster care. Maybe your family literally could not afford to feed you anymore. And so you leave. And if you're queer, then you're like, I'm going to LA. You know, I'm going to go to Hollywood. Because you're already, like, in these street youth kind of communities, you know to go to LA. And you find any way that you can to get to LA. The stories about traveling to LA are crazy. You know, truck stops, truckers, things like that. Kids do everything they can to get to Los Angeles. It's warm. They think you can pick oranges off the tree, that you can sleep at the beach, that Hollywood, you could find a job. You know, those fantasies are still out there. Yes?
So collecting narrative and collecting people's stories is a really difficult research process that can sometimes, whether intentionally or unintentionally on the part of the researcher, can lead to like a co-optation of that person's story in the search of like capital A authenticity or capital T truth. So how do you as a researcher try to balance that and in stitching together your stories maintain a degree of what that person was trying to communicate while also speaking to your research?
I think having a really good literature review where I know what other researchers have said about homeless youth or homeless adolescents in Los Angeles. And that helps back up kind of the stories that I have. But for me, like, that's a good question about co-optation. In fact, it's something that we've talked about before. When I was a teacher, we used to publish some of the youth stories that we would collect. This is before I was a grad student. And I never put my name on the books. They were youth stories. They published them. And we had this huge disagreement with one of the storytelling artists that we work with. She wanted to have her name on the book, and that the names were afterwards with. So it was going to be her name, and then with, and then all these youth names. And that was really troubling to me because I thought, well, this is their book. You know, like, we're not going to profit from it or anything like that. Like let them have their book that we're going to publish. And I think that it's an ongoing struggle to try not to be the anthropologist or the ed researcher that co-ops. But you know, when you do research and you take someone else's story or it's offered to you, I think it is about like the care that you take in how you talk about them, and also the care that you take in what you do with those stories afterwards. Because it's so easy to turn someone's story into like a story of pity. And I don't ever want the youth stories that I've collected in my research to be these stories of pity. I want them to see them like, here are young people who survived despite all these things. I want them to see resilience and strength. And so in some ways you have to flip the frame so that you don't tell a story of deficit or dehumanization. You know, and that's really something that is always on it's always on my mind. Like, oh my God, did I say too much? Oh my God, should I even touch the story? You know, what do I do as a researcher myself? Like, how do I talk about these stories as resistance? And that's something that I always struggle with. That's a good question. Susan.
Thank you so much. I'm sitting back here struggling with the story you told us about the woman who was witness to a trans person's murder. And I'm sitting here thinking about, you know, what our responsibility is as researchers and ethics, and like what, you know, I'm grappling with it, and I can only imagine how you've thought through this for the last X number of years. But I'm wondering, like, in that situation or a similar situation, is our first and most important responsibility to maintain her anonymity and protect our subject, or is there a higher sense of ethics that we might also be responsible to? How did you wrestle with that? How do you sit with that?
It's anonymous, so there's no way that I can officially contact her or anything like that. Although young people have found me through Facebook, but there's nothing that connects them to any of the stories that I've collected or researched. She was 23. She was one of the oldest people that I interviewed. So she was 23 years old when she told me that story, and she was trying to finish her diploma. So that's why she was at the school. And so with that story, I was like, whoa, what do I do with this? She told it in a group interview with young people, because we were getting young people together to go and do a presentation at another high school, right? So I said, all right, let's practice our stories before we go to Valley Alternative School. And so everyone had their story of what it meant to be queer, and then she told that story. And all the kids were like, whoa, what do we do with that? You know, not what do we do with that, but like, how are you? Are you okay? You know, like, how did you survive this? You know, like, this idea of telling the police, that didn't, I don't want to say that it didn't occur to me, but I know that it was on her if she wanted to. And as a researcher, what I could do is, I always had a list of resources. And so I'm like, if you want to, I can, like, IRB forced me to have backup. I said, I have a friend who's ready to talk to any of the queer youth who have experienced like this great trauma or have witnessed great trauma. I said, so that you can go talk to a mental health professional. And so those kinds of things are offered young people. But I think it's not on me, especially with anonymity. I won't go to the police, you know. I've seen enough of the young people who have gone to the police and seen kind of the end result of that. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know how helpful police will be. I don't know what her complete complicity was in that incident. She knew exactly what was supposed to happen. I gave her all the resources that I could to say, like, hey, with the story, like, you know, here's all these places where you could go talk to somebody. But for her own sake, I think, for her to tell a story too, I thought, with this gang, I thought she would be in danger too. Mm-hmm. You know, if that's what they do to queers, I'm sure it wouldn't have been so hard to find her. Mm-hmm. So I left it at that, you know. I don't know what the ethics are behind that, really. I put it in, but I've never done anything with it. And sometimes I talk about it because I'm thinking about it now because I had found that transgender age of remembrance recently. So I was like, you know, like, I forgot about that story. What do I do with that story? And other professors were like, you should go and publish just on this story because it talks about your interviewing skills. And I'm like, you know, I'm not sure if this one needs to be done in that way, you know, and you know, like, there's been other, like, sociologists who do, like, the economy of crack houses and other kinds of people who collect stories of other kinds of, like, informal economy kinds of things. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to go there. That's a good question, too. Now I'm going to be thinking about it like, oh, my God. Yes.
I've been thinking a lot as you've been answering that question about how you experience yourself as a researcher in situations where you might witness things that you might want to intervene in. So I guess it's a big question. Like, how do you think about that? Have you had instances where you've had to grapple with that? Like, what would it mean for you to also be someone who's there as a possible intervener in something happening?
Well, like I said, I've been a teacher for 7 years, and I was an HIV counselor, so I have all this training. So one time I was interviewing a kid, and he had a heart attack on me. He had been tweaking for days, so he hadn't slept for a long time, and he was hungry, so I always had like a whole bunch of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in my backpacks and stuff like that. I always had tons of food, and then he started getting sick and started having like his heart started racing. It was like in the 180s, like he had just finished a sprint, right? And so I immediately called 911 and I write about that one actually, where I had to deal with the paramedics who were so rude to this kid. Mm-hmm. Like, they were like, are you on meth? You know, did you do Viagra? Because if you're on Viagra, kid, you're fucked up. That's what the paramedics told this kid. And I said, well, wait a minute, where are you taking him? And they're like, well, you know, all the hospitals are full, maybe county, I don't know, you know, and you know, they were so lackadaisical about, like, here's a kid having I think a heart attack. I don't know, you're 17 years old and you have a heart attack. And I think, and I felt like, oh, I'm witnessing what these, you know, like, I didn't think about it then, but later on when I look at my field notes, I was like, oh my God, you know, like, what happened? And another time, a kid tried to jump off a roof when I was there, right? And so I was late for my appointments at this school, and so I drive up, and there's a kid sitting on the 4th floor, dangling his legs over the ledge. And I'm like, what the fuck? So you had to run up the stairs, right? And so I run up and I'm like, I see the first teacher, I'm like, oh my God, like Andrew's on the roof. The second thing, and I go and I pull him off the roof. He was such a big kid. It didn't occur to me that maybe he could pull me off the roof too, right? But things like that, sometimes you just react, and those things happen multiple times, working either as a teacher with vulnerable populations of youth or as a researcher. You know what? I was just ready for it. It's exhausting though. So after Andrew and the police came and 5150'd him, and he ended up in White Memorial for what is like a 72-hour hold. I was supposed to go meet Luis Alfaro, the poet, because he was going to come work with my youth. So when I was driving, after all the adrenaline wore out, man, I just had to pull over and throw up. Because it was so, I thought about it later, I'm like, this is so horrible, And so, how did I deal with it? I played rugby, like I was really, I was really physical and did lots and lots of like fitness and things like that. I wasn't a stress ball as a grad student, probably because I was, like I took it all out of the field. And I had another family outside of graduate school. There's graduate school and all the pressures of being at UCLA, but I had another family, and that was the rugby team. And I thank God for them because, we'd stretch and stuff, and I'd be like, oh my God, this is what happened today, and then I could take it all out in the field and leave it there. So I felt like I was physically super healthy at that time, and I thank God for that. Like, you have to be an athlete to be an academic, I think, sometimes.
Let's thank Cindy for